So proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting
Morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. We've got one lady with us, two ladies. Great, glad to see you. Welcome. All right, we are the Steel City, right? Right. We have a lot of history in the steel industry. We helped build this country, girder by girder. And one of the areas that was prolific in making steel was the Homestead area. And there's a furnace down there, an old steel mill called the Carrie Blast Furnaces, and we are honored to have Susie Tolman, who is one of the, I guess, a docent, or you're kind of the director of education. Oh, okay. Anyway, she's going to talk about some of the history of that area, and in particular the Carrie Blast Furnace. She's with an organization called Rivers of Steel. I have taken this tour, and I'm here to tell you, you need to do it. It's really interesting. How they do all this, and the temperatures that these blast furnaces get metal to are incredible, just absolutely incredible. So a great tour, so I recommend you do it. So I'm going to let her run away with it. Susie Tolman.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I know you were expecting a big, hunky steel worker to come in, as one of the gentlemen told me. Sorry, but you got a big, hunky Irish woman here. I'm a retired park ranger from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and wanted to continue my environmental work and started teaching on our boat. Our boat is that 3-story red, white, and blue boat on the Ohio River right behind the Science Center. We do environmental programming, and we also give tours of the city, which segued into me going over to Carrie Blast Furnace to start giving tours there. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay. So from 1884 to 1982, iron was produced at Carrie Blast Furnaces. Iron is the main constituent in the production of steel. I've got 2 clickers here, so bear with me. Oop, there we go. Okay. Iron makes up 5% of the Earth's crust and is second in abundance, only to aluminum, among the metals, and fourth in abundance behind oxygen and aluminum among the elements themselves.
Center button.
Center button. Yes. So sorry. There we go. Okay, let's go back here. What's going on here?
Upper button is
back.
backwards.
Sorry, gentlemen. Something's not right here. Okay, I'm not synced up with this. Okay, so iron ore is smelted into a product that is essentially pure iron that is then made into steel. The basic recipe for iron is iron ore, some limestone to absorb the impurities, tons of coke, and rivers of water to cool the infrastructure. So here we look at the resources that are needed. Iron ore is that giant piece of metal on the left. Nowadays, they use taconite, and I'm gonna pass some taconite around for you to see. Taconite, oh, there we go. Taconite is about 70% iron, as opposed to those giant pieces of iron ore that we used to get from the Mesabi Range. They're only about 28% iron. So we're leaving most of the slag back at the Mesabi Range in Minnesota when we started to use the taconite. The taconite is iron ore that's been pulverized. It goes through a magnet. They save the iron, add some clay, put it into a centrifuge, and in 1950, Dr. Davis invented this taconite. You can get so much more of that into a rail car, and it's easier to move around in the facilities, and you have much less slag to have to dispose of afterwards. Okay, so next ingredient. This just shows iron ore. It's a common metal that is found in the Earth's crust, just like I said. You can see the sources are Canada, United States, Brazil, Venezuela, and Australia. In Pittsburgh, we got most of our iron ore from the Mesabi Range in Minnesota, except in the wintertime, because something happens to those Great Lakes. They freeze, and then the ships cannot get through with the iron ore. So that was when we would get our iron ore from Venezuela. Okay? Okay, the next ingredient is limestone. So on the left, you're gonna see a picture of North America, and that is the Great Ice Sheet from the Ice Age. As you look at the layers of moraine on the right, deposited after the Ice Age melt, you can see where Pennsylvania, I know he said there's a pointer on here, Pennsylvania is right at the base of that ice melt. If you've been to Moraine State Park, it's named Moraine State Park because it is the terminal moraine of the ice sheets. That is where the ice sheets ended. So what Pittsburgh got was the meltwater, and that meltwater came rushing down through the Allegheny Plateau, carving our three rivers and depositing all of these materials, okay? So that's how that came to be. Limestone is a carbonate sedimentary rock, often composed of skeletal fragments of marine organisms, such as coral. So I say marine organisms, coral, that is seawater, is it not? Well, prior to the Ice Age, we were below the equator. That's where Pennsylvania was. After the last tectonic event, where Africa collided with North America, it pushed us up above the equator. But the damage was done. We already had an inland saltwater sea with all of those critters. Those critters died. They dropped into the bottom of the water. Over heat, time, compression, turned it into all of the elements that we use now, the coal, okay? That is how we get those different layers, okay? So limestone aids in the melting of the iron ore and acts as a flux or a sponge. It collects up all of the impurities in the iron ore, creating a gangue, G-A-N-G-U-E. Gangue becomes lighter than the iron mixture itself, so it floats to the top, and it's now called slag. And when you tap the slag, you tap it first off of the back of the furnace so that you have almost a pure iron product coming out of the front of the furnace. Let's move on to our next ingredient. If I hit, there we go. Okay, you can't drink it, you can't snort it, but it is called Coke, okay? Coke is a portmanteau for coal cake. Take the CO from coal, take the KE from cake, and you get Coke. Coke is bituminous coal that has been heated for approximately 18 to 24 hours. It removes all of the tars and the gases from the coal, and it creates Coke, which is very light, very porous, and highly flammable. This is your ignition. You need massive amounts of coke to get that furnace hot enough to smelt the other materials inside the furnace. That's what the coke does. If we look at this map, you can see the Pittsburgh coal seam. It is the richest bituminous coal field in the world. It threads a vein across the ocean from Canonsburg, Pennsylvania to Cardiff, Wales. Needing massive amounts of coke for iron production, Pittsburgh became the epicenter for that coal. We had the coal, so we became the steel city. The final resource is water. We see our rivers, we see transportation of coal here, but that wasn't what the rivers were used for when steel production started. It'd be really hard to transport giant pieces of steel on the water without them sinking. What the water was used for was cooling purposes. You had to cool the furnaces that got up to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You had to cool the stoves that blast the hot air into the furnace because they get up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You're generating massive amounts of electricity, which creates a lot of heat. So our three rivers were used to cool these facilities. Many of you may have heard the Monongahela River's nickname as the hardest working river in the world. And the reason for that was, if you go to our beautiful fountain at the point and follow it 12 miles upstream to Braddock, Pennsylvania, that entire 12-mile stretch of the river was recycled daily into the mills along the river. There were 47 blast furnaces along the Monongahela River alone. So daily, 12 miles of that river were going into these mills and back into the river. They would go back in very warm and with a lovely cocktail of toxic chemicals in them. The average temperature of the Mon River in February during that time was 99 degrees Fahrenheit. And I don't know if we have any polar bears in here who like to jump in the river in March, but if you were to jump in the Mon during that period of time, you'd come out without your skin because the pH was almost 0. It was basically an industrial dumping ground. That was what the Mon River was used for. In 1930, they declared that river dead. And I don't know how many of you have driven past or know anything about the Mon River now, but there's about 85 different species of fish living in that river today. As the steel industry dropped, Mother Nature came back in and healed herself with a little help from a couple regulations called the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. So now this river is fishable, it's swimmable, it's an amazing success story for Pittsburgh. We lost our steel industry, but we gained back an environment that invites other people to come and live in our city with us. Another ingredient that made Pittsburgh the steel city were our immigrants. Well, we're all immigrants, aren't we? But these gentlemen came by the thousands through Ellis Island to Pittsburgh to work in the mills. Why did they pick Pittsburgh? What was so special about Pittsburgh? Well, Carrie alone had 28 miles of rail lines. Carrie had 7 furnaces. Carrie had 6 Cowper stoves. The decibel level at one of these mills is off the charts, and if any of you gentlemen have ever worked in one of those, you know what I'm talking about. It's so loud you can't hear yourself think, and there's no way you can talk to one another. So hand signals were used to operate these places. So where else could these gentlemen from Croatia, from Romania, from Poland, where else could they come to America and get a job where the language was not a barrier for them? It was a mill. So that men stood by the hundreds at these front gates of these mills every single day, hoping to be the next person to get picked and get a job in one of these places. All of those factors combined to make us the steel city. We had a little help from a man named Mellon. He brought a lot of his seed money here as well. But the water, the immigrants, the natural resources, that is what set Pittsburgh apart from any other city. And that is how we were able to capitalize on the industry. We certainly weren't the first ones to make steel. We can go all the way back to the 1st century, but full-time in the 5th century in China is when they first started to make steel. They would puddle the steel. Puddling process converts pig iron into wrought iron by subjecting it to heat and stirring it in a furnace. It was the first method that allowed quality wrought iron to be produced on a large scale. The blast furnace. It was invented by Abraham Darby in 1709. George Ludwig Auschwitz, along with Baron de Blicklin and William Emberson, built the very first furnace in Pittsburgh. They built this in Shadyside. The first furnace was on 2 Mile Run, and it produced cannonballs for General Anthony Wayne's army, as well as castings of stoves and grates. George used charcoal to heat in his furnace. That was what they were using at the time. So he was totally deforesting the Shadyside area to get enough timber to run his mills. Couple that with the fact that he ran out of trees, the price of iron went up, and so he eventually lost his business. But what Abraham Darby did was he pioneered the use of smelting iron with coke rather than charcoal, because he realized the unlimited amounts of coal that we had in this area. And that was how the first blast furnace was, with coal or coke. How about those two dapper gentlemen? They're ready for the links. They are the Phones brothers, and they were iron merchants in Ohio. And they caught wind of what was happening here in Pittsburgh, and they wanted in on it. So they got together with their friend William Clark, and they tore down a blast furnace in Port Washington, Ohio. And they dragged it to the Monongahela. They set it up, and in 1884, they blew in their first batch of iron at Carrie Blast Furnace. You can see the deed right there. Going backwards. Okay. Carrie, where'd that name come from? Carrie was the daughter of William Clark, and she was the first one to light the fire at Carrie Furnaces. For those of you who remember all of the furnaces in the Pittsburgh area, they were Eliza Furnace, we had Lucy, we had Beatrice, we had Harriet. They were all named after a female from the owner's family. It could be his wife, it could be his daughter, but they were all named after women. Thought about that for a while. I guess we are a little volatile, and that's why they picked female names for all of these furnaces. I'm just going to go with that. Okay, so the Phones brothers, they're making iron at Carrie, and they're selling it on the open market. So you could come with a cart, and you could buy iron from them. And they were very small, and they were having a hard time competing because the valley was now full of mills and forges, and they were small bananas. They didn't know how long they were going to last. And in comes a young Scotsman. Might not recognize his face, but I know you recognize the name. That would be Andrew Carnegie. He came to Pittsburgh as a 12-year-old from Dunfermline, Scotland, and he started wrapping bobbins in a textile factory. And he got a job on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he worked very, very hard. He taught himself telegraphy, worked his way up to be the superintendent of the western portion of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And he had a boss we all should have, Thomas Scott, because Thomas sat him down and said, Andrew, I'm going to teach you how to invest your money into companies that today we would call startups. And he invested his money in oil and steel because he desperately wanted to be a player in the steel industry. So by 30, he had amassed himself a pretty nice amount of money. What was he going to do with that money? Well, he went upriver, and he built the Edgar Thomson Works. Okay, this is a fully integrated steel mill, the only fully integrated mill left in Pennsylvania. When I say fully integrated, I mean they make iron and steel at that facility, which in Pittsburgh was an anomaly. And why? Well, we have very small alluvial plains, don't we? And they're always followed by a steep hill. So iron was made on one side of the river and steel was made on the other side simply for spatial reasons. Edgar Thomson is the exception. They're down to about 400 employees from about 4,000, but they are still operating to this day. He named it Edgar Thomson because that was the name of the man who happened to be the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. A very savvy move on his part because his first order was for over 2,000 rails for the trains coming east. Made him a multimillionaire. That's when he went across the river and he purchased the Homestead Steel Works, which was the largest steelworks in the world at the time. So he now owns 2 steel mills, and he's getting some of his iron from Carrie. But Carnegie was a huge proponent of the vertical integration business method, which means you buy up every step of a process so that you can undercut all of your competition. So he owned shipping lanes, he owned part of the railroad, he owned coal fields, he owned everything he needed to literally undercut his competitions by 50 cents on the dollar. He had cornered the market on the steel industry. And to top that off, he went to London and he met with Sir Henry Bessemer. The Bessemer process, Bessemer converter. Go over to the south side, right between Station Square, you see that big rusty R2-D2 from Star Wars? That's a Bessemer converter. That took steel making from a 2-week process to a 20-minute process. Revolutionized steelmaking in England, and Carnegie brought it back and he put it in at Edgar Thomson, and no one could touch him. He was making steel in 20 minutes, everybody else 2 weeks. It just catapulted Pittsburgh into steel stardom, and it made Carnegie rich beyond his wildest dreams. 1901 comes. He's been through one strike, he's been through the Homestead lockout. He's decided he's going to divest himself of his entire steel fortune, and he sells it all to J.P. Morgan and Associates, and they turn it into U.S. Steel, which is what Carrie was until it closed its doors in 1982. Okay? So, we've gone over a little bit of the history. Let's make some iron. Okay. This is a stockhouse, the trestle, or the high line above the stockhouse. Every furnace has a stockhouse where the materials are stocked in V-shaped bins from the ceiling of the stockhouse. So the train goes up on top of the trestle, and it has bottom drop doors. The men up there stop them over the appropriate bins. They disengage the doors. The materials drop down into these bins where they can later be transported up to the top of the furnace. This is what a bottom drop door would look like on one of the trains. There were 28 miles of rail lines in Carrie. Just think about the noise level as we sit here in this quiet room. It was just deafening. We still have trains that go by, sometimes 2 at a time, and you have to stop everything because the noise level is so high. Multiply it by all of these trains going through, and it's hard to find a steelworker that doesn't wear hearing aids, doesn't go to a chiropractor, and isn't taking heart medication for all of the gases that he ingested. Okay, right next to the trestle or the stockhouse is the ore yard. There were several ore yards at Carrie. That catwalk that you see is 100 feet high. So that is how large the stockpiles were at Carrie. Carnegie never stopped production. Production went 24/7. If you stopped production for any reason, you lost your job, no questions asked. These men had no job security, and this was a big issue. Carnegie never wanted production to stop, and so that's why there were always huge stockpiles of the materials needed. Okay, this is the car dumper that's right next to the ore yard. The train cars could come in, and instead of the men having to hand shovel all of that ore out of a train car, which is what these men did for many, many years, absolutely back-breaking work, emptying these cars of all of that iron ore, dumping it into the yard. When the car dumper came along in 1928, this was a game changer for these men. What would happen is the car would come in, it would get attached to that wall, and the entire wall would tilt the contents down into a transfer car, which the transfer car could run the length of the ore yard, and that big crane I showed you with the big bucket could take it out of the car and dump it into the yard. No more manual labor for these men. This is the inside of the stockhouse. You can see there were rail lines because everything at Carrie was manually operated. You weren't going to find an electric button there until sometime in the early 1900s. So everything these men did was done manually. They would push the scale car in the stockhouse all the way over to the skip pit. You can see the V-shaped bins at the top. That is where the material from the trestle dumped down into. So they could go along with the scale car. The scale car would go along under those bins, it would open the arm, and it would put the amount needed in the scale car. That scale car would weigh it out, and then they would push it over to the skip pit where it would get dumped into a skip car. These are skip cars. They kind of look like the inclines in downtown Pittsburgh. They're funiculars, just like our inclines. They're cable-driven. They meet in the middle. They go their opposing ways. These skip cars go down into a skip pit in the stockhouse. The lid opens, and the men have 2 minutes to fill that with a couple tons of material so that the lid can close and it can ride to the top of the furnace. Think about how often have you gentlemen and ladies had to buy a bag of rice and put the rice into another container at home? How much of that rice ends up on the counter as you're pouring the bag into the container? Invariably, some of it's going to not make it in. Think about the fact that these men all day for 12 hours, every 2 minutes, have to make sure they get all of that material into that car. Because if the material misses the car, it dumps down into the skip pit, and the car can no longer sit down there. If that's the case, they raise the car, they turn it off, you're handed a shovel, and you crawl down into this 15-foot pit, and you hand hoist up whatever you dropped. When you're done, you come up, you hand your shovel to your employer, and you walk out the door. You stopped production, you just lost your job. No questions asked. These men did 12-hour shifts down there, and every 2 minutes, they had this concern of getting that material into that car. Not only are they working in a dark, dirty, dangerous, loud place, they have this initial worry of making sure they get all the material in that car so that they don't lose their job. This is the path that the skip cars take from down here in the stockhouse. They ride to the top of the furnace where they dump their material into the furnace. Coke is the #1 ingredient, the most important ingredient. So every other layer would be coke. As that scale car goes along, it would get limestone, and they would dump that. Then it would get coke. They would dump that. Then they would get iron ore. So every other layer was coke, so that there was enough of that ignition in the mixture when it goes down into the furnace. Okay. Skip cars, they come up to the top of the furnace, and they dump their material down into the furnace. Many of you have probably been over to the pump house, over by the waterfront shopping. The pump house is what's left from the Homestead Works. And you may have noticed these 2 large things laying in the field. They are bells, furnace bells, and they are at the top. I'm gonna go backwards. They are at the top of the furnace, those 2 bells. So the material falls down onto the first bell, sprinkles down onto the second bell, and then goes down into the furnace. As it's going down into the furnace, hot air is being blasted into the bottom through a series of tuyeres, T-U-Y-E-R-E-S. And that is what a tuyer looks like. A giant 250-pound brass fitting, which was one of the first things to be cannibalized when Carrie closed. That tuyer has a glass plate on it. So the men could wear cobalt blue glasses. They could look through that glass plate into the furnace and see what it looks like in there. And what they wanted to see was a lava lamp. They wanted to see the heat buoying up all of that material, floating it, smelting it together. The limestone's aiding in the melting, and it's grabbing all of the impurities, creating a gang that floats to the top of that material. We'll go back to that one picture. Okay, let's go backwards this way. Okay, so the hot air comes in the bottom. You can see hot air. Get this yet, master this. Okay, you can see where the hot air would come into the bottom of the furnace, igniting the coke and starting the smelting process. This is the back side of Carrie, and this shows you the caliper stoves. And that's an interior view of the caliper stoves. There are 3 stoves for each furnace. You can see they're 104 feet high, they're 25 feet around, they're 2.5-inch steel plate, and they are lined with refractory brick. The refractory brick is lined in a checkerboard fashion inside that cylinder. So the air goes in, it gets heated, it heats the cylinder, and it heats the brick. And the brick is what maintains that hot heat, so that when they're ready to blast from this stove, it's at its peak, between 1,800 and 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, as it blows into the blast furnace. This whole process is called addition by reduction. You are adding materials to the furnace. They are going down into the furnace. As it heats and it starts to melt, it goes through 5 different chemical processes, as you can see here on the side. Okay. Hot air blasting in, material coming from the top. The molten iron gets tapped off here. The slag gets tapped off on the other side. Okay. Slag, once again, is lighter than the iron mixture. So it's called addition by reduction because we're adding materials and reducing them down to a molten state. Just another view of the furnace, and you can see the different levels. The coke, the iron ore, you can see all the gas and the dust that's collecting at the top. We all know that hot air rises, so that is where all of that gets caught up at the top. After about 4 to 6 hours, it's time to tap the furnace. And that man-made volcano, it's ready to come out of the furnace. All of the workers in the cast house go into a building that has a steel plate over the window, steel plate over the door, and there is one gentleman up in a little bird cage, and he brings a gun around that has a poker and an oxygen probe on it. He pokes a tap hole into the bottom of the furnace, gives it a little bit of oxygen, and that human volcano spews out in a giant arc into a trough. Now this trough has been scrubbed and allowed to dry, and then it's pammed, if you will, with black sand so that the iron will not stick to the trough itself. It's concrete, it has dimples in it, you don't want that iron sticking. And so that's what will happen before they actually tap the furnace. So you can see the iron pouring through there. I have a couple of color photos on the iPad that are a little more dramatic, which I can show you when we're done here. Okay, this shows one of the runs, okay? The ambient temperature in that cast house is 140 degrees Fahrenheit. These men have on street clothes, they're working greens, and a coat made out of, can anybody guess what their coat was made out of? Out of asbestos, because we're gonna kill them one way or another, right? And they wore those until well into the 1900s, let me tell you. They are standing right next to 3,000 degrees molten iron in 3 layers of clothing. The room's 140 degrees, and these men worked 12-hour shifts, 14 days in a row. 14th day was a 24-hour shift, followed by 12 hours off. So they're tired, they're fatigued, and they're very, very hot. And one of the men has to put a board across that steaming volcano and serve as a spatula, if you will, moving the iron down. And he's standing on a wooden board. So he's relying on his partner, who has been working 8 days in a row for 12 hours, to tell him when to jump. Because that board he's standing on will catch on fire, and he will fall down into the molten iron if his partner does not tell him when to jump. Okay. Early on at Carrie, iron was poured into ingots. They would dig troughs into the ground, and they would pour the molten iron into those troughs. They would allow them to cool. As they cooled, the men said, look at that, they look like little pigs laying there. And that's where we get the nickname pig iron, okay? Later on, the iron was taken across the river in a molten state. Remember, it's about 2,800 degrees by the time you get it out of the furnace. So bottle cars, torpedo cars were constructed. They have 2.5-inch steel plate, and they're completely lined with refractory brick, just like the Cowper stove and just like the blast furnace. They can pour that hot metal into those bottle cars. They are then attached to a rail car that will take them across the river. But how do you get something that volatile across the river safely? You build a hot metal bridge. Okay, this bridge is 6 times stronger than the bridges we take our cars over. It's constructed of 2.5-inch steel plate lined with refractory brick. And this is the remnants of the one right by Carrie, which we found out next year they are going to start turning that into a bicycle bridge to add to the Gap Trail. So we're very excited about that. You'll notice the car has its own lane on the bridge. And they only took a few over at a time because you're taking something incredibly hot across a body of cold water. If even a small amount of that iron were to fall into the river, the steam explosion would have been catastrophic. It would have taken out the bridge and the towns on both sides. So they had to assure safe passage of these cars. If they were to derail, if they were to hit a bump, if something horrible would happen, they had to make sure that they could dike anything that came out of that bottle car. And that's how we got the hot metal bridge. We talked about the fact that iron was made on one side of the river, steel on the other side. There are 7 hot metal bridges in the world, and 4 of them are on the Monongahela River for that reason, okay? We've all seen the beautiful one on the south side that they repurposed in 2012. We can drive over it, we can walk over it, we can take our bicycle over it. This one will be bicycle only when they are done. Okay, once the iron leaves Carrie, it heads over to the Homestead Steel Works. largest steelworks at the time, 400 buildings, 330 yards, almost 3.5 football fields. There was a small section called the Ward left at one time, and a lot of you gentlemen may remember when that was completely condemned, and the U.S. Navy came in World War II, and they did top secret construction there. Couple that with the fact that Bettis is a little farther inland from Carrie, and a lot of submarine work being done. Oops, okay, let's go back. There we go. All right, so this is an aerial view of the facilities that are still standing at Carrie. In 1982, the place closed down for good. The men came to work, they were told, clean out your lockers, we're done. We're completely closing. It sat dormant for a short period of time, and then the Park Corporation came in, and they cannibalized anything of scrap value. So those giant Tweers I showed you, they were one of the first things to go. Some of them went to ET, but the rest of them got sold for scrap. Most of the rail lines are gone. A lot of things are not connected where there was something valuable that they could sell for scrap. When they were done, they turned it over to Allegheny County, who turned it over to Rivers of Steel. And we applied for National Historic Landmark status, which we received in 2006. But by that time, the only thing that was left of Carrie is what you're looking at right now. But it's plenty to interpret what those men and later on what those women did at this facility. These are the faces of those men. They came from every country in Eastern and Southern Europe. They worked these grueling shifts at these hard, dark, dirty, dangerous jobs. They put up with the infighting created by management, because if they can have ethnicities or races fighting with each other horizontally, they're not going to complain vertically. And so they put up with all of this. But when you got up into a cast house, or you were down in the stock house, or you were doing something where you needed to have your brothers back, they definitely did. These men were a brotherhood as they worked next to one another. But think about in 1941, this place almost completely cleared out of men because they went to fight a war for us. And they fought a war for us, and then they came back and they finished their careers doing this dark, dangerous, dirty, loud job. This generation was absolutely incredible. (1941), like I said, the place emptied out, and we invited Rosie the Riveter in. All those mills along the river were now, they weren't manned, they were womaned now. All of these jobs were taken over by women. Accident rates did not go up, productivity did not go down, and these women did a fine job for us during the war. They met the demands of these very short fuses on some of the things that the government needed. All of the steel for every tank and every destroyer came from Homestead. 60% of the armaments, all of the barbed wire, all of the nails, and many of the shells. We were the arsenal of democracy for 3 wars. Think about that. Go back to that hot metal bridge. If you've ever flown into Pittsburgh, we're really easy to identify with those 3 rivers, aren't we? Really easy to identify for our enemies. And during the wars, Korean, Cold War, afterwards, we were number 1 and number 2 on the hot list and the hit list for all of our enemies. So we were in a very vulnerable position, because if they bombed those bridges, which were quite evident from the air, iron did not get made into steel, and we couldn't defend ourselves because we made most of what was important in Pittsburgh. How many of you had to wear a dog tag to school? Sorry, I forgot my metal dog tag, but it looks just like a metal dog tag. I grew up in Mount Lebanon. I went to St. Bernard's, and we had to wear a dog tag to school every day. It had my name, my address, my religion, and in case of emergency, what it should have said was who to give the body to, because they created these, the civil defense created these for us to wear. They started with plastic, and they realized plastic wasn't going to withstand any of the bombs. Metal might. At least we might be able to identify us. And weekly, we crawled under our desks to have drills. And this went on for years until the Cold War ended, because we were such a big threat. We had the very first Nike missile base in the country in South Fayette, the Missile Master. If you ever, they're turning it into a microbrewery, so you'll be able to go out and get a beer and tour the silo pretty soon. My dad was retired Navy, and we shopped at the commissary there, and they put mirrors under our cars, and we had to wear dresses, and there were Army men everywhere. They were prepared to level the Mon Valley if they had to. If the threat came this far west, they were just going to level it. We have 12 bunkers around the city, around the county, in high places, and they were manned by servicemen 24/7, and they were guarding our bridges. Those bunkers are still here today. One is a brewery, one is a gymnasium for middle school. These are large bunkers, and these men were guarding our bridges. That's how big the threat was for us. Joe Mazurak. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce it in Croatian. It's beautiful in Croatian, but I don't do it justice. He is their Paul Bunyan, the steelworkers' Paul Bunyan. If you look at him, he has a very broad face. He has huge ears. He has a flat, large nose. This is a conglomeration of all of the men that came from Eastern and Southern Europe. They wanted him to look like all of them. And this stands out in front of Edgar Thompson, looking a little faded right now. His pants aren't as bright orange as they are in this picture. But he was strong. He was born in a steel mill. He could bend a girder. But most importantly, he represented all of those men and later women that toiled for those long hours because he would have done anything for his fellow worker. He's not the only symbol that we have in Pittsburgh. Now, we see this, we see Steelers on there, we know football, we know tradition. These steel workers, they were beer-drinking, Steeler-loving men. But that means more than what you see right there. Mr. Rooney put a contest in the paper, and the word Steelers won. So he went to the Steelmark company and asked, can I borrow your logo and put ERS on it? We're just gonna put it on one side of our helmet, try it out. And we're still the only team in the NFL that has it on one side of our helmet. We never changed. But what does that mean? What happened? Okay. It's disappeared. Okay, we'll just go back to the Steeler one then, because I don't know what happened to that slide. Anyhow, I had a slide that just says steel on it, and that's the Steelmark logo. Those are 3 hypocycloids, and they represent what it takes to make steel. The yellow one is coal, the red one's iron ore, and the blue one is steel scrap, because in the United States, almost 70% of the steel that's made here is made using steel scrap. And so not only does it represent our famous football team, but also represents who we are. We are the Steel City. Going backwards again. Okay. What goes on at Carrie now is a little different than what went on from 1884 to 1982. We give public tours, industrial tours, historical tours. You can come and you can see this place. I like to equate it to the USS Arizona Memorial in Hawaii. This is a tough place for some people to come. They may have lost a loved one in one of these mills. And that was a hard thing because there was no closure for those people. When someone was killed in this mill, you were told to go to the morgue, the body was already there. You weren't told how they died, where they died, did they suffer? Did they have any last words? Things that you want to know for closure. These families never got this when they sent their husbands or their sons or their brothers down to one of these mills. Were they going to come home with all of their limbs? Were they going to come home whole? Were they going to come home at all? These jobs were so very dangerous. And that's what we like to concentrate on as we go through and show you how iron was made and what these men had to do to make it. Hard to believe, but we hold a lot of weddings in one of our buildings. I told you these buildings were cannibalized. They took all of the scrap. So the AC powerhouse where electricity was generated when electricity came to Carrie is now a very large empty building. And we held about 30 weddings this year in there, wedding receptions in there. So that building gets an awful lot of use. You can see the size and scope of it. We do a lot of lectures, guest lectures in there, a lot of art programming. Wow. Okay, We also give graffiti tours. When Carrie stood abandoned, that's when a lot of the young people came down, unsupervised. They had giant walls where they could design their art, and some of it you can see is absolutely beautiful. A lot of it tells the story of Carrie. This one in particular, that was done by a group of Mexican art students. They came up in conjunction with the University of Pittsburgh. They got a grant to study our industrial history, and that included a tour of Carrie. And when they walked over there and they saw the white-tailed deer just running amongst all of this big, heavy equipment, they went to their trunk, they pulled out some paint, and within 8 hours, without any stencils or pre-drawings, they created that masterpiece. And that's exactly what's going on at Carrie now. We have all these converging interests. We have artists who otherwise may have never, ever stepped foot at Carrie, but they can interpret Carrie artistically. You can see the natural element because it's gone back to nature. We still have all of the big buildings, but we're also a nature preserve, which we can embrace as well. So it's a very interesting dynamic now at Carrie. We give iron garden tours. There's a section of Carrie that's been left completely alone. And what you get to look at is what is growing, where is it growing, why is it growing in that pattern? It's a very interesting tour in succession. Once a place that's been completely abused is left to be dormant, and then Mother Nature comes back in, and what happens during that time. We hold a lot of concerts and plays. King Lear, we just had Macbeth at Carrie. American Ninja Warrior had one of their shows there. We have all these different kinds of concerts and different type of ethnic activities. Giant concerts. This is one of the Thrival concerts. You can see how they light the place up. We're a nonprofit, so we rely on a lot of donations, and we have a lot of rust at Carrie, a lot of rust to keep track of, and a lot of it to keep ahead of so that we can have folks like you come and visit. And the way we do that, the way we can generate some revenue is through production companies. So if any of you are watching A League of Their Own, the movie they turned into a television show, when they're on their practice field, that's at Carrie. American Rust with Jeff Daniels, that's on Showtime, I believe. These are all sad steel murder mysteries in Pittsburgh. We don't shoot very many musicals at Carrie, but we shoot a lot of scary things. Out of the Furnace, if any of you saw the movie Out of the Furnace with Christian Bale and Woody Harrelson, that was shot almost exclusively at Carrie and right up in Braddock. So we do a lot of this. We're doing the Mayor of Kingstown now with Jeremy Renner about the prison. So we do a lot of this because these production companies, they come in and not only do they pay us nicely, but they'll also enhance an area once they're done. So we kind of scratch each other's backs, let them use the place, and then we can get maybe some fencing done or some rusting repaired. Our Festival of Combustion, we just had this a couple weeks ago in October. This is our annual festival. This is where you get to come and you get to see metal pours. You get to see hot aluminum going into buckets, and you get to scratch into a box. You scratch a design into it, they pour the molten aluminum into it, and you take it home as a souvenir. But you get to see, we have a furnace called Gomer, and it's less than 1/100th the size of one of the blast furnaces, but we use it regularly to educate children in how iron was made and how they can use it for different purposes. Carrie Carpool. During the pandemic, we put a giant screen on the blowing engine house, and we held movies, drive-in movies. We had Pittsburgh Month, bad Pittsburgh movies. We had Family Month, we had Horror Month, and we did this throughout the entire pandemic to bring people into Carrie, something they could do easily, socially distance, and enjoy themselves. And our Carrie deer. If you've ever seen a picture of Carrie, it probably had the Carrie deer in it. This deer was constructed by a bunch of those kids that used to hang out at Carrie when it was closed. They formed an organization called the Industrial Arts Co-op. And as they walked around Carrie, what they saw were a lot of deer, and they decided, we want to make a deer. The only rule was everything on that deer had to come from Carrie. So you're looking at old hoses and rebar and metal scrap and locks, anything they found laying on the property, and they turned it into a lovely deer, which we have on our property now. The workers. This is on the trail on the south side, and it was created at Carrie by that group of artists I just told you about. And it is a lovely representation of the toiling they had to do with the large buckets and the large pieces of equipment. It's a lovely piece of sculpture. And there's our man. And there's Carrie. Just a little bit about Rivers of Steel. We were created in 1996. We are part of the Rivers of Steel, the National Heritage Area. I have a map of the National Heritage Area over there. We celebrate the region's industrial history, the landscape that fueled it, and the hardworking men and women who made it possible, linking its communities through their shared cultural and industrial heritage. We are part of an 8-county industrial heritage area here. So we do things, we couple things with different organizations all through these counties to bring the message, to keep the message alive. We want everybody to know what these men and what these women did. Look at a bridge. Look at the St. Louis Arch. Look at a skyscraper. Look at the knives, forks, and spoons you eat with. Look at the lock walls on the Panama Canal. This is all Pittsburgh steel. These men made all of this stuff. They did it by working horrible hours under horrible conditions, making next to no money. But they are so proud of what they did. Stop an iron worker, stop a steel worker, and ask them to tell you their story. And they want to tell you their story because they know they built America. They know they made our lives so much easier, and they know how hard it was for them to do it. But they came to our country because we had food. They could worship the God they wanted to worship. They could vote without being shot at. They could educate their children. These are things we take for granted. These men crossed an ocean when they were 13, 14 years old, came over here and toiled for us to get that American dream. We owe them so very much, the men and the women that continue to do it today to build our country and make our lives so better. We know how lucky we are right now with what things that are happening around the world, and these men helped us to do that. So with that, I'm done with my PowerPoint. I have brochures over there. I have answer questions. I have an iPad with a lot more pictures on it. So whatever you want to do right now, we can do.
We're going to open it up. Any questions?
Oh, thank you.
Questions? Thank you, Susie.
Yes, hello. Could you tell me, where are we getting most of our steel from right now?
A lot of our steel's imported. Indiana is still very active. Gary, Indiana. Alabama still has some steel mills. A lot of it is imported.
Where's it imported from, the vast majority, do you know?
From China.
China? Wonderful.
Yeah.
Actually, I spent my life in the scrap industry, did a lot of business with U.S. Steel and every other steel mill in this area. Today, 70% of the steel produced in the United States comes from scrap. As Susie mentioned, we're producing, I think, about 80 million tons a year in the United States. And traditionally, about 20 to 30 million tons is imported. So the vast majority of the steel consumed in the United States is produced in the United States. And the electric furnace shop has really taken over. Yes. We have some electric furnace shops still in the Pittsburgh area, Allegheny Ludlam at Brackenridge, AK Steel up at Butler, Elwood Quality Steel in Newcastle, and there's a new mill where Wheeling Pittsburgh used to be in Steubenville. It's called JWS, and a new mill is going to be going into the old J&L Aliquippa Works. That's going to produce about 500,000 tons a year. So steel is still an integral part of the U.S. Steel industrial base, and the largest steel company in the United States today is Nucor Steel. So that, hopefully that gives you an idea, but honestly, most of the steel that we consume is good old USA steel.
And keep an eye on Cleveland Cliffs, because that is a company that has started to buy up some of the other steel companies, and they've shown interest in Edgar Thomson and the Clairton Coke Works and Irvin. So we may see a little shift there in name or ownership. We'll have to watch that in the near future.
Right, and Cleveland Cliffs started life as a iron ore producer. They've got, I think they get most of their iron ore from Canada, the Quebec region. And I guess the two integrated steel producers today are AK Steel, Cleveland Cliffs. I'm not sure if there's anyone else, but Jim made a good point. 70%, and Susie mentioned the same thing, 70% of the steel that we use is recycled scrap. And on Neville Island, there's a large shredder, auto shredder. Some of these shredders can shred up to 30 to 40,000 tons of steel per month. So that's where all your cars and appliances end up going. And it's a great way to clean scrap and get it in a position to, go to market. But so I think just a little addition. Here we go.
Hi, do they have any statistics at what the mortality rate or injury rate was back then?
So there are, if you go to the Allegheny County death records, but that's funny you mentioned that. We have a young man right now who is working on verifying deaths at Carrie, and he's up to about 152 verified ones. So a lot of them, the deaths occurred later on, like the 142 we know for certain died on site right now, and he's just started his work. A lot of them died in hospital. Several of them, sadly, died by taking their own lives later on because they couldn't tolerate the pain from the injury that they sustained. So those numbers are not included in the actual who died at the facility. So, but if you go to the Allegheny County death records, you will see that about between 26 and 41 years old, and look at the years, you'll see that most of these men perished in one of these mills. It was horrible at Carrie, but it was even more horrible over at Homestead because they had the open hearths. So if an incident occurred there, you were vaporized. So what the family was given was a ladle full of steel to bury, because they had no body to bury. So these accidents were devastating. You'd lose a limb. If you lost a finger, they would say, is the finger on your left hand? And you'd say, yes. Are you left-handed or right-handed? I'm right-handed. Oh, well, you'll be fine. That's not your dominant hand. Everything was monetized, and not very generously. Yes, sir?
I do a lot of research on the shipyard in Amherst during World War II.
Joe and I were talking about that before.
There were a number of accidents. Okay, and there were a number of accidents at the shipyard, which fatalities, all had autopsies. They were reported, and so the number and who died and when they died was all there. Did Allegheny County then conduct autopsies for all of the industrial accidents?
That's a very good question that I cannot answer. I will tell you, though, that Carnegie purposely did not keep records because he could feign ignorance. If I don't know, I don't know because I don't have any records, but I honestly can't answer that about the autopsies. Unless a family pushed for it, I don't know.
Well, when I say an autopsy, it went to the coroner.
Yes, went to the coroner, okay. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Would you explain again the significance of the Steeler logo with the three colors?
Okay, the three colors, they're hypocycloids. The first one represents coal or coke. The second one represents iron ore. And the third one represents steel scrap. And that's what it takes to make steel in the United States. Just like we were talking about that 70% steel scrap. So that's why they have those three hypocycloids, yeah.
Susie,
Yes.
you mentioned burying a whole ladle of steel when somebody died. Are
Yes.
you familiar with the legend of how Joe Magarac ended his career?
Yes.
Tell the story.
Well, you might tell it better than I do. Go ahead. They'll listen to you for a couple minutes.
Well, it was one of the Great Depressions, and they came along, and he got the word that they were going to shut down his steel mill. And he just didn't know how he would live without working in the mill. And so as the last heat, that's what they call when you tap a furnace, a quantity of steel, when the last heat was tapped out of the, probably an open hearth at the time, he jumped in it saying, by God, this will be the strongest steel that ever was made.
That's right. Then Arnold Schwarzenegger did it in The Terminator, right? Yeah, he got that from Joe.
When the Trade Center went down, China was the first one to put a bid in for that steel. But Congress wouldn't let it happen. They sent the steel to Alabama or Louisiana, and they built a USS New York out of it. And she's anti-piracy. And she came back, she sailed right in the New York harbor so that we could celebrate our steel work.
That's a great story.
The thing about our steel is the ingredients that come out of Minnesota and all those places are not found any other place in the world.
Right.
So our steel is the greatest steel. Even the scrap steel is so purified with the ingredients, it's unbelievable.
Yeah,
everybody wants our steel.
Yeah, you're right.
And we can produce that today without belching
Absolutely. There's
stuff in the
arc
atmosphere.
welders, there's arc furnaces in Alabama that work, and it's fascinating. You can YouTube it, you can see the arc. And electric arcs, yeah. And it less manpower, a lot of buttons to push as opposed to doing everything manually.
How much does one of those break out?
The newer ones?
Yeah, the newer ones. You know, you were telling me in so many hours, the open heart, the new one, how long is it? How much? 25 minutes. That's incredible.
Isn't it? It's absolutely incredible. Yes, sir.
I have a processing question for
Yes.
your slides. So was this a batch process or was this a continuous flow?
Continuous flow.
They constantly added
Correct.
Ingredients to the top and they constantly pulled
Exactly.
iron out from the
Yes,
bottom.
which is a hard concept to understand because it creates a sort of a scab, and then as the iron melts, it melts down into the zone where it can be tapped. But it is a continuous flow, yes, continuous feed.
Any other questions?
Any question?
No, here we go.
Just a real quick comment. My father worked in an open hearth, and you were talking about how hot it was, but how many layers of clothing they had on. They also had wooden soles on their shoes.
Yes, they did. So they would cut out wood to shape the footwear they were wearing, because there were no metatarsals, there were no steel-toe boots, and they would strap those to their shoes, and because the floor was so hot, it would singe their feet or their shoes. And they would last about a month and a half, 2 months is what we were told, and then they would have to redo that process all over, and that wood would turn into charcoal. It's just incredibly hot. That is one of the things they did do.
Was there another statue called the Mill Hunky that was produced?
I don't know if there, I'm going to look that up,
And
though.
I think they took it away because people...
Because it said hunky on it?
Yeah.
Okay.
But he had I remember seeing a picture of it. He had like a steel helmet on, and he was a huge...
So you might be talking about, so Frank Lloyd Wright was commissioned by the Kaufman family to build Falling Water. And when he came through Pittsburgh, they said, you're an architect, what should we do? And he said, I think you ought to drop a bomb and start all over again. Because he came through at the height of the steel industry when the streetlights were on all the time. And we were three-shirt Pittsburgh. He wanted this giant steel worker at the point that actually would have jutted out into the Monongahela River. And you can Google it, it'll come right up. Giant steel worker with steel pouring out of these buckets. It was massive, and it was going to be next to a little park where Point State Park is. Well, when they saw how garish it was, I mean, we're a blue-collar town. Joe Mazurak's about as fancy as we get, right? So it was kind of poo-pooed, and I think it would have been very, very expensive. But when he saw Pittsburgh, he just... there's nothing you can do. James Parton, an author, came here to study Pittsburgh, and he described Pittsburgh as hell with the lid taken off. Another author from Britain came over and said, 6 months in residence and I'm ready to commit suicide. It was just, that was what the place that was filthy, Three-shirt Pittsburgh because you wore a shirt in the morning. You had to change when you got to work because it was filthy. If you went out at lunch, changed again. When you got home, you changed a third time. My mom rode the trolley to work, and she wore white gloves every day, and every night she said they were gray. She had to scrub them, and just from riding the trolley. And it was just, you couldn't escape the dirt. Living near a mill town, I don't know how those women did it. What those women would do, though, they lived in squalor on the hillsides next to these mills, and they were paying rent to the mill owners. So, the little money they were making was going back to the mill owners. But they would do their very best to keep a bed clean. a nice bed clean. And this guy works night shift. So he comes to my house and I feed him breakfast and he gets into that bed and he sleeps in there all day. This guy works day shift. He comes, they pass each other in the yard. I feed him dinner and he crawls into the bed that this guy just got out of. That's a turnstile bed, 2 rents for the price of 1. And that's what the women would do because they weren't welcome down in most of these mills until World War II. And if they had young children at home, they couldn't go be a domestic or anything. They had to tend to the children. So they would have turnstile beds. 10-year-olds would go down to these mills to get jobs. What could a 10-year-old do? He'd be a water boy. He would be outfitted with 2 buckets of cold water and a ladle. And I told you how hot the place was. And he'd go around and he'd hydrate all these workers so that they wouldn't pass out or worse yet. These men lost 5 to 7 pounds of water weight every day. They started taking salt pills in the 1915 area, and a lot of them are on heart medication now because they OD'd on the salt tablets trying to keep water in their bodies. So their bodies were, you know, the hearing aids, the chiropractor, the heart, their bodies were just beaten to the point of no return because of how hard they worked in these places, these very unforgiving places. Yes, sir. Okay, our tours, the industrial tour is a 2-hour walking tour. And we start at a little map on the wall. We tell you what's here, and then we walk you through the car dumper, we walk you through the stock house, we walk you through the cast house, we walk you through the stove deck. All the whole time, we're talking about the history of the place and how iron is made. So it's a 2-hour, you're moving almost the whole time, and it's a 2-hour tour. The Iron Garden tour is almost about 2 hours as well, but we concentrate on the biology of succession. And then we also have an arts and grounds tour. These artists that make all of these beautiful sculptures, they're all over our campus, and so you can come and just take an arts and grounds tour where you will see what types of pieces of art they made and why, what's the meaning behind them. Right now we have giant clotheslines hanging down with mini greens on them. The greens the men wore, this guy made like thousands of greens, and each one has a message on them, and they're hanging right now on a giant clothesline at Carrie as you pull in to let the, you know, just another aspect of what these men had to do. They wore those greens, which were fireproof. Later on, they did start to get equipment that was safe. 1892 was the Homestead strike. That was when Frick, who was Carnegie's partner, Frick was actually the man that encouraged Carnegie to go over and buy Carrie. He said, we need to put that into our portfolio. Frick was a very unsavory character. He hated unions, he enjoyed busting up unions, and when they purchased Homestead, they inherited a union, the American Amalgamated Iron and Steel Workers. It was a small union, but a very powerful one. And these men were paid on tonnage at this time. And Frick and Carnegie wanted to change it so that they were paid based on the open market, which meant one day you're gonna get 50 cents, the next day you're gonna get 25 cents, or the next day you're gonna get 32 cents. And the men said, no, we want paid strictly on tonnage. Their contract was ready to expire. Frick didn't even wait. Carnegie went to Scotland on vacation, and Frick put up a notice telling them this is what was going to happen. And he locked out all of the workers at Homestead. Once he locked them out, he had already built a giant fence around the entire Homestead. They nicknamed it Fort Frick. It had sniper towers. It had water cannon towers. This guy was prepared for the worst. And these men would position themselves all along the Monongahela River, watching downtown, because tensions were so high. And sure enough, first week in July, 2 barges are coming up the Mon, and they can see that the men are dressed as Pinkerton guards, who were basically guns for hire. They were vigilantes. And Frick had hired them to keep the peace in Homestead. If they made landfall, it would be at that water tower I showed you, at the pump house. That was the only place they could make landfall. And the men along the river told the townspeople there were 10,000 people waiting for those 2 barges. They set the river on fire, which wasn't hard to do. Remember, I told you there were a lot of nasty chemicals in that river. They set the river on fire. They set a few boats on fire, pushing them downstream. They actually got a cannon from the Civil War, and they were lobbing cannonballs at these barges. But sadly, they made landfall, and 12 hours later, 11 men lay dead. They did surrender. They went through a bloody gauntlet up through Homestead. They were hidden in the Opera House, and the next day taken away by train. And about 4 days later, 8,000 state militia were sent in by the governor to keep the peace. Now, these men, they have no rainy day funds, no IRAs, no savings accounts. They are living hand to mouth. And this is July, and they're not allowed back in, and Frick doesn't want to talk to them. And this goes on until November. Now, the churches are completely broke because they have been helping all of these people. The gardens are done in Pittsburgh for the year. And the union, the one union, went belly up because they took some of the men from that crowd and accused them of murder, and they needed to hire attorneys to defend those men. So not only did they break the union, they won that battle, but they won the war, because the first week in November, winter's coming in Pittsburgh and these men are terrified. So they went back to work under those oppressive rules. And it was like that until 1935 when the Fair Labor Standards Act was signed. So they went almost 45 years, even under J.P. Morgan, working this way until unions were allowed to come in and introduce themselves and find out, do you want to be unionized? And they were. And the very first president of the United Steelworkers Union was Philip Murray. And he was a godsend to these workers. He came in trying to get them basic needs that every person should have on their at their workplace. You know, safety equipment, job security, hours that didn't kill you, all of these things. And you all know how many bridges we have here in Pittsburgh, right? There's a number everybody throws out. It's 446. A bridge here in Pittsburgh is anything longer than 20 feet that spans something, okay? So we're one of the cities of bridges, but we only have one suspension bridge, and it happens to be right in the heart of steel country, right on the Monongahela River, that big yellow suspension bridge. Anybody know its name? That's the Philip Murray Bridge, okay? So we named a bridge after that man because he came in here and he helped unionize these steel workers who, when these places closed, they were making a very good wage and they had really great benefits. One of the benefits in some of the mills was a 5-year, 15-week vacation rotation schedule. So after 5 years, you got 15 weeks of vacation. We live in Pittsburgh. When are you going to take that 15 weeks? Summertime, right? Summertime. So all of a sudden, there's all these vacancies in the mills. These guys are all taking their vacation. Who's filling those jobs? College boys. My husband paid cash for college, graduated, and a week later bought a brand new truck with cash, because he got to work in the mills, and it paid for everything. 15 weeks, he made enough to pay for college every year, and he made enough to buy himself a truck. This was a win-win situation for the young men in these areas, as well as the steel mill. The men got their vacations, the work got done, and young men found out, A, am I cut out to work in the steel industry? And they left with a really nice pocket full of money to do with what they wanted. So that was a great situation once the unions came in and did that.
All right. Susie, thank you very, very much.
You are welcome.
That was interesting.
There are two different kinds of brochures over here. Like I said, I have an iPad with a lot more pictures on it and a map of the heritage area, if anybody's interested.
A couple quick things. Lunch today at Eaton Park here in Wickley. Don't come next Friday.